Morning. If you'd like to turn your pew Bibles to Esther, chapter 4, verses 12 through 11. That'd be on page 180. Or 780. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, nor night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Thank
you. Do you believe in destiny? It's a rather mind-boggling concept. You might remember old Forrest Gump was even confused by it. He didn't know if Mama was right or if it was Lieutenant Dan. If we each have a destiny or if we're floating around accident-like on a breeze. He figured maybe it was both at the same time. Well, I don't claim to have a full understanding about what our destiny is or how we can determine that. I just know that it is a biblical concept. God has a plan. Our destiny is to allow Him to fulfill that plan. We see from many biblical accounts that certain people were put in certain places at certain times under certain circumstances for that very reason, to fulfill what God had already planned. I mean, what else can we say except that Jesus was destined for the cross? Abraham was destined to be the father of the Hebrew nation. Joseph was destined to rescue his people from famine. Moses was destined to free his people from Egypt. Joshua was destined to take his people into the promised land. Daniel was destined to speak truth to power in Babylon. David was destined for the throne in Israel. Mary was destined to be the mother of the Messiah. And we can name many other examples as well. But today we're going to look at the story of Esther and see how she was the one who was destined to deliver the Jewish people from destruction. So why was Esther successful in fulfilling her destiny? And what can her example teach us about God's destiny for our lives? We see 4 elements in God's destiny for Esther. First of all, God revealed Esther's destiny through a gigantic problem. Now, just to review the story of Esther for those who may not be familiar with it, Esther lived in the time of the Persian Empire. Now, when Babylon had overtaken the Jews, they had taken many of the Jews captive, and they brought them from their own country to live in exile in Babylon. The prophets of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel were prophets to the people at that time. Well, then years later, Persia overpowered Babylon, and they allowed many of those Jews who had been in exile to return to their homeland. Ezra, Nehemiah, and the second part of Daniel all wrote about that period of time. However, there were many Jews, for various different reasons, who remained in Persia. The best estimate that I could find were that there were approximately 22,000 such Jews who were not able to return to their homeland and thus remained subject to the leadership of foreign authorities. Esther was one of those Jews. And the book of Esther has to do with those Jews who remained in Persia. Now, Esther had a cousin named Mordecai. Mordecai was really more of a father to Esther than a cousin because he raised her after her parents had died. And so here, all they had was each other as Jewish exiles in a foreign land. But through a series of amazing coincidences, these two humble Jewish exiles changed history. It's almost like a fairy tale or a Disney princess movie, but these things really happened. Now, I find it interesting that the name of God is not even mentioned in the whole book of Esther. But yet, the hand of God is clearly at work throughout this entire story. And all of these coincidences, these events that just happen to coincide with each other, all working together to bring about another example of God stepping in to rescue his people. And whenever we have stories like that, that is always something that I point to the New Testament and point to God rescuing all of us through our faith in Jesus Christ and his death on the cross for us. So let me just briefly summarize these coincidences and how they are connected to this gigantic problem that God's people would face. First of all, the king of Persia was Ahasuerus. I had to look up how to even pronounce that. His Persian name was Xerxes, and the NIV usually just puts Xerxes in there. I hope it's okay with you. I'm just going to call him Xerxes rather than to say Ahasuerus 20 different times. So at the time of Xerxes' reign, the Persian Empire was as large and as powerful as any empire has ever been in the history of the world. It extended from what is now India to what is now Ethiopia. And so that means that Xerxes was one of the most powerful men who has ever lived. His queen was named Vashti. Vashti actually had the audacity to stand up to King Xerxes one time, and she refused to come when she was summoned. He wanted to show off her beauty in front of a bunch of people, and she just didn't want to come in to be gawked at. We read about that in chapter 1 of Esther, verse 10. It says that he commanded to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Xerxes did not like Vashti standing up to him, and so he just got rid of her. He had her deposed. The Bible doesn't specifically say what exactly happened to Vashti, but it wasn't good. Most scholars believe that she was executed. That's what they did back then. But at the very least, she was never heard from or seen again. It's important to note what happened if Xerxes was not pleased with his queen. It was widely known that you just didn't stand up to King Xerxes, not without major consequences. Well, the set of amazing coincidences started when Xerxes wanted to replace his queen. In chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "The king's personal attendants proposed, 'Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti.' This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it." So the king's attendants came up with this idea of having basically what was a Miss Persia beauty pageant. They herded up all the most beautiful women in the land, and the one who would please the king the most would be the new queen. And Esther was one of those ones who was forced to come and be evaluated by the king. And this went on for 12 months. For 12 months, these girls were given beauty treatments, and they were brought in individually to stand before the king. I don't think they had swimsuit and talent competitions, but who knows what they did. Well, at any rate, when the king saw Esther, contest was over. She was the one that he picked to be his new queen. He considered her the most beautiful girl in the land. Now, following Mordecai's advice, Esther had not revealed her nationality to anyone. I suppose Mordecai felt that that might have jeopardized her safety. But here now we have, just out of the blue, this young Jewish girl was now the queen of Persia. Coincidence number one. Like I said, like a Disney princess movie. Next coincidence. While all this was going on, a conspiracy had arisen to assassinate King Xerxes. And it just so happened, since Mordecai was trying to keep an eye on Esther, and he was being discreet about it because he didn't want anyone to know that Esther was a Jew like he was. So Mordecai was just kind of hanging around the king's gate at the palace and trying to keep an eye on Esther. And one day while he was doing that, he overheard two of the king's officials talking about this conspiracy to kill the king. And so he got word to Esther about that. And then Esther got it reported to the king that there was this Jewish man, Mordecai, didn't say the connection to her, but just this Jewish man, Mordecai, had uncovered this conspiracy. And so it was investigated. It was found out to be true. The conspirators were caught and they were hanged. And it was recorded in the government records what Mordecai had done for the king, but generally just forgotten after that. This would come into play later. All right, the next coincidence. Some time had passed, and now another character enters the scene. A man named Haman had been promoted to a seat of honor higher than any of the other nobles. And everyone was instructed by King Xerxes to kneel down before Haman whenever they saw him and to pay him proper respect. And of course, everyone did that. They didn't mess around with the king's orders. Everybody knew that. Everyone, that is, except Mordecai. He just wouldn't do it. He would not kneel before anyone but God. Everyone told him to just do it. What are you, crazy, Mordecai? Just kneel before the guy. What's it going to hurt? But he just wouldn't do it. And in that process, he made an enemy of Haman. And we see Haman's reaction to that in chapter 3, verse 5. It says, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down and pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So he went straight to the king with his plan, which included a little bribe. And in verse 8, it says, then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. So the king said, why not? Okay, go ahead. He issued this decree, and it was all set up. Verse 13 of chapter 3 says, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Gonna kill them all, might as well take their stuff too, I guess. All right, so much like the Nazi Holocaust of the 20th century, God's people in Persia faced total annihilation. And so this was the gigantic problem that revealed Esther's destiny. What might your destiny be? I couldn't possibly know what it is, but I could conjecture that whatever it is, God will reveal it to you in the midst of some sort of problem, some difficulty. It's in the midst of a conflict or a difficulty or an issue where a resolution needs to be made, that we usually discover what it is that God has for us to do. But secondly, Esther threatened her destiny with a protective excuse. Mordecai sent a message to Esther to ask her to go into the king's presence and to beg for mercy and to plead with him in behalf of the Jewish nation. But in verse 9 of chapter 4, we read that Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is for the king to extend the gold scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Self-defense, self-preservation, self-protection are very highly developed and deeply rooted responses in all of us. They're not easily challenged and not easily resisted. For any of us, if we are faced with the prospects of being harmed by something, our first instinct is to think of how we could avoid that harm. And so it was only natural for Esther to react and respond this way. I mean, what else would she think? She couldn't just go to the king anytime she wanted to, even though she was the queen. That's just not how things worked back then. She could not enter the king's presence unless she was summoned, let alone ask him to grant a request of some kind. And everyone saw what happened to the last queen who dared to go against the king's orders. And plus, at this time, the king didn't know that Esther was Jewish. And there was no telling what would happen if this Gentile king discovered that this queen was from among a people that he had just given permission to be annihilated. Self-preservation is a God-given instinct. He put it in us, the desire to preserve our life. And so it is wise, it is prudent to use the discernment that it takes to avoid something that could potentially harm you. Whether we're talking about actual physical harm, or maybe harm to your reputation, or harm to your prosperity, or maybe even something that just might hurt your feelings. There's nothing wrong with wanting to protect yourself. But there are times in each of our lives when God calls us to put aside that instinct to protect ourselves because there's something important that just needs to be done. We live in a fallen world. It's full of hate, and anger, and danger. And sometimes serving God means putting ourselves at risk in order to do the right thing. We can get hurt out there in this fallen world that we want to reach for Christ. So Esther was just naturally reacting to Mordecai's request by seeking to protect herself. But that excuse was something that threatened her destiny. And so the next step was that Mordecai clarified Esther's destiny with a loving challenge. As Bill read for us in verse 12, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this." So Mordecai made a couple of very significant points that spoke to Esther's reluctance to approach the king in behalf of the Jewish nation, but which also speak to the very heart of you and me and situations in which we might find ourselves. First of all, Mordecai expressed his complete faith in God's promise to preserve the Hebrew nation, as he had always done. No matter what God had allowed to happen to his chosen people, always at least a small remnant of the nation was spared and preserved. And so Mordecai challenges Esther that if she's not willing to be the vessel that God uses to preserve his people, then God would just use somebody else to do it. Esther and her relatives may die, and many other Jews may die, but God will use something, or he will do something to preserve a remnant of his people. In the same way, God has a plan for your life, and he wants to use your life to accomplish his will. And it's great to know that God has a purpose for you. He has a plan he wants you to fulfill. But if you are unwilling to follow him and to obey his call in your life, he'll find someone else to do his will. He will find another way to complete his plan. God cannot be thwarted by our disobedience. And so if we don't fulfill that destiny, if you want to call it that he designed for us, he will fulfill it one way or another. Our excuses will not prevent the will of God from being accomplished. He'll simply use somebody else who is willing, and they'll get the blessing. But Mordecai was telling Esther, it really does seem like God has put you in the position that you're in so that he can use you to rescue his people. All these things that have happened were probably not just coincidences, but rather God knowing what this Haman was going to propose, and that someone in a position of power would be needed to stop him. So Esther, the Jew who became queen of Persia, had most likely been placed in that position for such a time as this. And what a difference this understanding can make when you and I find ourselves in the middle of a difficult situation. We often find ourselves in positions that we didn't choose to be in. We don't want to have to deal with it. We'd much rather just stay out of it, do nothing and let somebody else take responsibility. We don't want to risk making a mistake or doing something wrong or having somebody be mad at us or losing something of value to us, or even perhaps risking our personal safety and security. But who knows? Maybe you have been placed in the situation you are in for such a time as this. And when we find ourselves in such situations, instead of whining bitterly, "Why me, God?" maybe it's the time to genuinely ask, "Why me, God?" But who knows? Maybe you have been placed in this particular situation for a reason. God, why have you placed me in this particular situation at this particular time? If you believe in a sovereign God, then it is probably not a coincidence that you are in that position. Maybe you're the one who is supposed to be a peacemaker between people who are in conflict with each other. Maybe you're the one who is supposed to speak sense to an unreasonable person who won't listen to anybody else. Maybe you're the one who is supposed to bring comfort to someone who's hurting. Maybe you're the one that God wants to use as a testimony of a godly example in times of trial. Maybe you're the one who needs to step up and to defend somebody who's being mistreated. Maybe you're the one who's supposed to take the initiative to bring God into the whole situation and to lead people to pray. Maybe you're the one who's supposed to tell somebody about Jesus. Maybe you're the one who has been called on to risk something in order for God to do His work in that situation. Maybe it's you that has been put where you are for such a time as this. Well, we see that Mordecai's challenge got through to Esther because ultimately Esther fulfilled her destiny by sacrificial obedience. In verse 15 we read, "Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, 'Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish.' So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions." Esther tells Mordecai, "Ask everybody to pray for me because I'm scared, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to approach the king, and if I die, I die." So what she means is, I've seen this enormous problem. I've tried out my excuses. I've considered the loving challenge, and now I'm ready to obey God. I will take the risk that logically may not make a lot of sense, but spiritually it's what God is leading me to do. And the results of Esther's obedience were profound. If you're not familiar with how the story turns out, I will try to quickly summarize it, but you really should read it for yourself just to appreciate all the irony of the story and the providence of God. In chapters 5, 6, and 7, it kind of concludes the story. But just to summarize it, Esther did enter the king's presence, and she told him that she had a request. And Xerxes was very open and willing to do whatever she wanted. That alone was a surprise and a blessing. But rather than talk about the plight of her people, Esther simply asked if she could have a banquet the next day and invite Haman to it. And then she would tell him at the banquet what her request was. So Haman heard about that. He got an invitation to this banquet from the king and the queen, and he is all excited because he believes he's going to be honored by the king and the queen. Then he sees Mordecai hanging around the palace like he'd always had around the gates, and he can't believe that Mordecai has the nerve to do that when he knows about the king's edict to destroy him and his people. And so Haman's feeling pretty cocky about things right now, and so he has some gallows built, and he plans to ask the king when he goes to this banquet the next day if he can hang Mordecai on those gallows, since he's going to be honored on that same day. So one day he's going to be honored and he gets to hang Mordecai, and he can't wait for tomorrow. Well, meanwhile, our next coincidence is that while all the Jews in the land had been fasting and praying for 3 days about Esther going to see the king, it just so happened on the night before the banquet that King Xerxes had a hard time sleeping. Couldn't sleep that night, and so he's staying up, didn't know what to do. Maybe that's just a coincidence, I don't know. But anyway, he stayed up and he started reading the records of the events of his reign. And he came across the information that it was Mordecai who had uncovered that plot to assassinate him. And he says, "We need to honor this guy for saving my life." And so the next day before the banquet, he consults with Haman, one of his chief officials there, and he asks him, "If I wanted to honor someone, what do you think I should do?" Of course, Haman thinks the king is talking about him, and that's why they're having this special banquet so he can be honored. And so he answered the king in chapter 6, verse 7. "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" The king says, "Hey, that's a great idea, Haman. So you're one of the king's noble princes. You go get Mordecai, that guy that's hanging around the city gates all the time, and do for him all those things that you said I should do for somebody I want to honor." Don't you just love it? I would have loved to see the look on Haman's face as he had to be the one to put the robe on Mordecai and put him on horseback and parade him through the city streets. And then, when he went in for the banquet, that is when Esther told King Xerxes that she was a Jew, and that Haman had talked him into this edict to destroy all of her people, all of Mordecai's people. And the king was furious at Haman for this. And someone told them, well, there happens to be some gallows that were just built out here. Gallows that Haman was planning to use to hang Mordecai. And so on those exact same gallows, King Xerxes had Haman hanged. Another one of those coincidences. But what I want us to see this morning is all the things that resulted because of Esther's willingness to be obedient to her call, to risk her own life in order to fulfill that call, her destiny, if you will. So what were the results of that? Well, first of all, obviously, the Jewish people were rescued and they were spared from annihilation. The king gave an edict that they were permitted to defend themselves against any attackers, and that they certainly did. But secondly, we see that justice was served. Haman, along with his 10 sons, were hanged. Chapter 7, verse 10 says, "So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided." And chapter 9:14 says, "So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons of Haman." Evidently, Haman had involved his sons in carrying out his evil plot. And we see that God is just. Sooner or later, justice prevails. The more obedient that we are to God's ways, the more likely that there can be justice on this earth. But either way, God sees that justice ultimately happens. And he sure did in this case. Thirdly, we see that many Persians became Jews, according to chapter 8, verse 17. It says, "In every province and in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews, because fear of the Jews had seized them." I take that to mean that they came to believe in the God of the Jews, who delivered his people against all odds. They wanted to be a part of that people and their beliefs. Next, we see that Mordecai was honored, and he left a lasting legacy. Chapter 9, verse 4 says, "Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful." In the last chapter of Esther, chapter 10, verse 2, says, "And all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the king of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews." If Esther hadn't done what she had done, this never would have happened, and Mordecai would not have had this legacy to pass on. And then last, but certainly not least, the Feast of Purim was established. In chapter 9, verse 28, it says, "These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants." This was a feast that has been observed by the Jews. It was not one of those feasts that was prescribed by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, so this was something that was added later after the story of Esther. And a lot of people believe that's one of the main reasons why we have the book of Esther in the canon of Scripture, so we know where this Feast of Purim was started. And the Feast of Purim continues to this day. And the Jews celebrate how Queen Esther saved the Jewish nation. And it was because of the book of Esther that we know what this feast is all about. So I ask you, what is your destiny? Only God knows that. But for you to fulfill that destiny, it probably is going to take you working through some problematic things, some very difficult things. Maybe not the potential destruction of a nation, but possibly the destruction of your family, or your livelihood, or your reputation, or something else. It will take getting past the excuses that you naturally will put up to avoid the difficulties that might be involved. It will take responding to the challenge to risk earthly and temporary treasures for the sake of something much more valuable. And it will take simple obedience to the calling of God in your life. And if you do that, God will take those circumstances in your life, those things that others might see as just being coincidences, and He will bring the results that He intends for you. So what do we know about what God's will is for everybody? Well, that is to be saved from sin and to be born again into a new life that is offered up to Him. So fulfill your destiny by receiving Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. Let Him help you with the problems that you have in your life. Get past the excuses that you might have and don't put it off any longer. Respond to his call to be saved from your sins and to enter into new life. And then watch what he will do with your simple obedience to his call.